Now, joining us today, we have Dr. James Kim, a research fellow from the Asan Institute for Policy Studies. Thank you for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
So perhaps what was not explicitly stated in that previous report was what President Moon said about the North Korean sanctions. He said, let me quote here, "We must further encourage North Korea's denuclearization process by easing UN sanctions when and if we decide the North's denuclearization process has at least reached a point of no return." So he's put a bit of a disclaimer on easing sanctions, but it's perhaps the strongest call for this lifting of sanctions that we've seen so far. What is your reaction to these statements?
Well, given that there's a lot of talk about the extent to which South Korea is coordinating with the United States, and the U.S. government recently, both the State Department and the Treasury coming out, reaffirming its commitment to enforcing existing sanctions. This was a big bet, another big move by President Moon. Some might even say daredevil kind of an act, if not a move. Let's see how this works out. But the international community has fairly strict standards about what they're expecting to see from North Korea. And there's a history of bilateral and multilateral negotiations involving North Korea. So I think that he'll find that the reaction from the international community, especially from the European counterparts, may be even further to the right from where he wants to be in comparison to the United States. But again, we'd have to wait and see how this plays out.
Let's take a look at France President Macron's reaction to this first and the press conference. Now, he said in response directly, he said, "We are ready to fulfill every mission to give us a permanent member of we are ready to fulfill every mission given to us as a permanent member of the UN Security Council to realize complete, verifiable and irreversible denuclearization of North Korea." Now, that's not quite as strong as what Moon perhaps might have wanted from what he said as well. There's a bit of speculation that President Moon might have wanted President Macron to give more leeway on that. But it seems fair that France is not quite ready yet.
There's really nothing that South Korea can offer France in terms of getting France closer to its position on the North Korean nuclear issue. In fact, in my view, there's absolutely no leverage here. So he can make an appeal for this process, and I think the French president would say that he supports a peaceful resolution to this issue. But the standard here is fairly similar to how it was under President Obama and previous administration in the United States. So again, I think that what this shows is that France is signaling to President Moon that there's a higher bar here, and it's not quite ready yet unless North Korea is willing to show something more, a more concrete commitment towards denuclearization.
So as you've mentioned, President Moon now has brought up the topic of easing sanctions on a global stage now. It seems like he'll be probably taking the similar message to it when he meets other European leaders this week. We've just heard that he'll be meeting with Theresa May, Angela Merkel, among others. But he seems to be, as you said, fight against the tide. You called it a daredevil move, perhaps. But what is the thinking behind this? And do you think he'll be able to have any kind of progress towards what he wants to achieve as well?
Right. I think there's at least two strategies or concerns here that are guiding President Moon and pushing him towards this path. One is obviously he's laying the groundwork to get the Europeans on board if the United States is able to make a deal with North Korea with the second summit that President Trump is scheduled to have with Kim Jong-un. If something substantive comes out of that meeting, then we can move forward with the United States on easing sanctions. But again, on the UN Security Council resolutions, you need to have unanimous support of the permanent 5 members. That includes France and UK. So he needs to tee them up in order to, if there is a deal, come later this year or earlier next year, that he can move towards easing of sanctions in coordination with the United States. The second motive could possibly be that he could be trying to rally the international community, even the members of the Security Council in the UN, to try to push the United States to move faster towards a deal with North Korea. And if he was able to convince President Macron, or even for that matter, Prime Minister May, on board with his proposal of making these concessions towards North Korea, maybe he thought that he could try to get the UK and France on board to try to push the United States to get a deal with the North Koreans. So there are two, I think, motives here. In my view, I think he's exploring them more so than he's actually embarking on that path.
But as you said, it is a big gamble. I mean, there is the risk that, President Moon might end up with egg on his face, especially if North Korea does, this back record of not fulfilling its promises. It's a big risk, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, or he got a cold shoulder from President Macron on this proposal, so he's already, in some ways, a bit discouraged. But so it's an uphill battle for him. So there's a lot of work to do.
Meanwhile, a U.S. State Department spokesperson has said they expect all UN member states to fully implement North Korean sanctions. And the spokesperson actually quoted President Moon himself, saying the improvement of relations between North and South Korea cannot advance separately from resolving North Korea's nuclear problem. Now, this comes after, of course, the two Koreas held high-level talks on Monday and agreed to further works towards connecting the rail and road networks, and have a groundbreaking ceremony later this year as well. The U.S. State Department statement seems to be expressing reservations about what some of Seoul is doing. How serious do you think these reservations are?
I'm not sure that this message is really specifically targeted to Seoul only. I think there's concern in the State Department with the de facto loosening of sanctions, and we're hearing some reports of that already in China and Russia. And there are possible loopholes here with the inter-Korean cooperation. And so I think what the State Department is signaling is that all parties, including South Korea, if it chooses to engage with North Korea, must be careful in not, violating existing sanctions regime. So I think it's really a statement that the U.S. is committed to its pressure campaign while it is engaging with North Korea.
U.S. President Donald Trump himself has said, he said North Korea is coming along very well. He said relationships are good. I think a lot of good things will happen. How do we reconcile what he said with what some of the U.S. State Department has done, emphasizing sanctions, ratcheting up pressure on North Korea?
So there are two possible explanations here and two hypotheses. We would probably never know, because without getting in President Trump's head, we won't really know what the intention is. One explanation, obviously, is that President Trump simply being honest and true to his policy of pressure plus engagement with North Korea. So while on the one hand, the pressure is being applied by the state and Treasury, on the other hand, he is working the diplomatic route and trying to engage with North Korea in a more effective basis to reach a deal. The second explanation here is that there's potentially a gap between the relevant agencies that are involved in enforcing these sanctions at the working level versus the White House. The White House has different ideas about how to push forward with North Korea, and State Department and Treasury has its own ideas about how to do that. Again, which one of these hypotheses are right? It's not clear for me to say. But if the latter is true, then simply getting a deal through a summit is not going to be enough in getting that agreement to stick, as we saw after the Singapore summit. Again, there's a lot of work here on all sides that needs to be done. And for the United States, there are some questions that needs to be asked. But if North Korea comes forward in an earnest way towards denuclearizing, then I don't think we need to worry about any of this, right?
Okay. So, well, some of those details you talked about on the working level, it was hoped that this new special representative on North Korea that the US have picked, Stephen Biegun, it was hoped that he would be able to work out some of the details with their North Korean counterparts and have a meeting in Vienna soon. That's what the US said previously. But now they're saying he'll be visiting Moscow, Paris and Brussels for working level talks with those counterparts. But there's no word on a North Korean meeting yet. I mean, what signal does that suggest? I mean, is that a concern that there is no movement towards working out with North Korea?
Well, one is that it takes two to dance. And simply because Steve Biegun is moving doesn't necessarily mean that the North Koreans are moving in tandem with the North Korean representative at the State Department. So it's not clear to me where the two sides are in order for a meeting to take place. Again, we'll have to see how this plays out in order for us to get there. But there are two reasons I could think of why Steve Biegun would be making these rounds to these other countries. First is again, as I've said before, there's a concern in the State Department about sustained pressure on sanctions. And it's a multilateral effort when we're talking about sanctions. And so he needs to make sure that everybody's on the same page with respect to participating in the existing sanctions regime, regardless of what happens on the diplomatic front with North Korea. So to get some sort of a consensus, to build a consensus, to tighten the screw around the multilateral effort towards pressuring North Korea to come out more earnestly to the bargaining table. Second is that after a deal is reached, you need to have all relevant stakeholders have a buy-in into that deal in order for that agreement to stick. And this involves countries like China, Russia, Japan. And if he's making rounds to Paris, he's clearly thinking about the Security Council as well. Again, this needs to be a multilateral effort, even though the negotiations are happening bilaterally. I think there's a sophisticated understanding here at the State Department that for many reasons, for keeping the sanctions in place, and also at the same time making sure that if an agreement is reached, that it stays in place, that the U.S. works multilaterally with many countries on this issue outside of just North and South Korea.
Well, I think that's where we're going to have to wrap things up. Thank you for coming on the show, and it's always a pleasure to have you here.
Thanks for having me.